not going to believe what happened to me last winter. I'm still not sure I believe it myself, but I've got to tell someone. My hands still shake when I think about it. I'm 74 years old and I've been living alone in these mountains for almost 17 years now. My cabin sits about 14 miles up an old mining road that most folks don't even know exists anymore. The Forest Service stopped maintaining it years ago, so it's just me and whoever's brave enough to drive a four-wheel drive up here. That's usually just the supply truck once every 2 weeks and maybe a fisherman or two during summer season. I moved up here after my husband Walter passed. The town got too busy, too full of memories. Up here, the only sounds are whine through the cedars, river water rushing over boulders, and the occasional elk stepping through my meadow. It suits me fine. I've got my herb garden, a few goats, and enough firewood to last through any winter. Or so I thought. September had been unusually warm that year. I remember thinking it was strange because usually by the end of the month I'd already had my first frost, but the wildflowers were still blooming and I was still harvesting herbs from my garden well into October. The goats were producing more milk than usual, and even they seemed confused by the extended summer weather. The old-timers in the valley had been predicting a brutal winter. They always do, but this time they seemed more serious about it. Every trip down the mountain for supplies, I'd hear the same warnings. Stock up early, get your firewood split, make sure your chimney can handle heavy use. The kind of talk that makes you pay attention even when you've heard it all before. I'd been through plenty of mountain winters, but something about the way the weather was acting made me nervous. Animals were behaving strangely too. The chipmunks were gathering food like their lives depended on it. Birds that should have migrated south weeks earlier were still circling around like they couldn't make up their minds. Even my goats were acting different, staying closer to the barn and bleating more anxiously than usual. By early November, I'd cut and stacked more firewood than I'd ever stored before. My little storage cellar was packed with preserved vegetables, dried herbs, and emergency supplies. I'd even bought extra feed for the goats and made sure my oil lamps were all filled and ready. Looking back, it's like some instinct was telling me to prepare for something bigger than a normal winter storm. The temperature drop came suddenly. On a Thursday, it was still warm enough to work outside in a flannel shirt. By Friday morning, there was ice on the water trough, and the weather radio was already talking about an unusual storm system forming in the north. The kind of storm they give names to and track like hurricanes. November hit us hard last year. By the second week, we'd already had more snow than most winters see total. The Weather Service kept talking about a massive storm system moving down from Alaska, something they were calling a once-in-a-generation event. I'd lived through plenty of bad weather, so I just did what I always do. Checked my supplies, stacked extra wood by the door, and made sure the goat barn was secure. But this felt different from the start. The air pressure was dropping so fast it made my ears ring. The wind patterns were wrong, too, coming from directions that usually meant trouble. The goats stopped eating completely and huddled together in their barn. Even during the day, my old joints were aching in ways they never had before. The first flakes started falling on Sunday evening, tiny and hard like bits of ice. By Monday morning, we had 8 inches of the driest snow I'd ever seen. It didn't pack at all, just blew around like powder. The wind was constant, but not terrible yet, just steady enough to keep the snow moving and make it hard to see very far. I spent Monday checking on everything twice. The goats had plenty of food and water, though they seemed restless. The wood pile was covered and easily accessible. All my windows were secured, and I brought extra lamp oil inside for the nights ahead. The backup supplies were tested and ready, though I was hoping not to need them. Monday night, the real storm began. The storm hit on a Monday night. I remember because I'd been listening to the radio earlier, and they were still talking about it like it might weaken before reaching us. But around 7, the wind started picking up, and by 8, I could barely see the goat barn from my kitchen window. The transformation was incredible to watch. What had been steady but manageable wind suddenly turned into something alive and angry. The cabin started groaning in ways I'd never heard before, and snow began hitting the windows so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of sand at the glass. By 9, I couldn't see my own porch lantern from inside the cabin. The snow wasn't just falling anymore. It was moving sideways, driven by winds that had to be gusting over 70 miles per hour. Trees that had stood for 100 years were bending like saplings, and I could hear them breaking in the distance. Sharp cracks that cut through the screaming wind. The temperature was dropping fast too. My thermometer went from 18 degrees at sunset to below 0 by midnight, and it kept falling. Even with the fire going full strength and every lamp lit, the cabin was getting cold. I could feel the warmth being pulled right out through the walls. No matter how much wood I fed the fire, by midnight, I knew this was different. The wind wasn't just howling, it was roaring. Snow was coming down so thick, it looked like a white curtain had been hung right outside my windows. The temperature dropped so fast I could actually feel the cold pressing through the walls, even with the fire blazing strong. The lanterns flickered around 0 inches the morning. Not unusual for up here during storms, but the timing made me uneasy. I had plenty of candles and extra lamp oil, but the cabin started getting cold faster without being able to move around and stay active. I threw another log on the fire and tried to get some rest, but the noise was incredible. Trees were cracking like rifle shots, and something kept scraping against the side of the cabin. Sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, something would crash in the forest, another tree going down probably, and the sound would echo through the mountains like an explosion. The wind was so loud it was hard to think straight, and the cabin was trembling with each gust. Around 0 inches the morning, I heard something different. A rhythmic pounding against the back wall of the cabin, too regular to be just debris in the wind. I grabbed a lantern and checked every window I could safely reach, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see anything. The pounding continued for about 30 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. By dawn, the storm was still raging, but had settled into a pattern. The wind would roar for 15 or 20 minutes, then calm down to almost nothing, then pick up again even stronger than before. During the calm periods, I could hear the settling and cracking of snow and ice, the sound of a landscape being completely buried. I managed to get the door open during one of the calmer moments and looked out at a world I didn't recognize. The snow was already 4 feet deep and still falling hard. My old truck was completely buried, just a white mound where I knew it was parked. The path to the goat barn had vanished entirely, and the barn itself was half buried in a drift. The goats were still alive. I could hear them bleating nervously in their shelter, but there was no way I could get to them safely. I'd have to wait for the storm to pass and then dig them out. At least the barn was sturdy and well insulated. They'd be cold and frightened, but they'd survive. Tuesday was worse than Monday night. The storm had intensified overnight, and now the snow was coming down so fast I couldn't see my own fingers when I held my hand out in front of my face. The wind was constant, no more calm periods, just endless roaring that made the cabin shake. I spent the day feeding the fire and checking for damage. The roof was holding, but I could hear ice building up along the edges. A few of the windows were developing frost on the inside despite the fire. The cold was winning slowly but steadily. Around noon, the pounding started again. This time it was on the front of the cabin near the door, rhythmic thumping like something was trying to get in. I peered through the window but couldn't see anything except swirling white. The sound continued for hours, sometimes stopping for a while, then starting up again from a different spot. I started to wonder if it was an animal, maybe a deer or elk, seeking shelter from the storm. But the sound was too purposeful, too regular. It was like something was testing the cabin, checking for weak points or ways inside. By evening, I was starting to worry about my supplies. I'd used more firewood than expected because of the extreme cold, and I was burning through my lamp oil faster than planned, too. If the storm lasted much longer, I might have to start rationing warmth. The pounding stopped around sunset, but by then I was too on edge to relax. Every sound the cabin made had me jumping. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps on the roof. I kept checking the locks on the doors, even though I knew nothing human could be out there in this weather. Tuesday night was a test of survival. The storm had been going for over 30 hours, and there was no sign of it letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was so loud I couldn't hear myself think, and the cold was seeping through every crack and gap in the walls. I pulled my mattress into the main room close to the fireplace and tried to sleep there. It was warmer than the bedroom, but still cold enough that I needed every quilt I owned. The fire had to be fed every hour, which meant I never got more than 45 minutes of sleep at a time. Around 9, I heard something that made my heart stop. It was crying. Not the wind, not tree branches rubbing together, but actual crying like babies, but deeper, somehow more resonant. At first, I thought the storm was playing tricks on my ears, but the sound continued even during the brief moments when the wind died down. The crying seemed to be coming from outside, somewhere near the cabin. It was faint but persistent, rising and falling like an infant's wail, but with an undertone that was definitely not human. My first thought was that it might be a mountain lion or some other animal, but I'd never heard anything quite like it. I tried to ignore it and get some rest, but the sound kept pulling at me. There was something about it that was deeply upsetting, a quality that seemed to reach right into my chest and grab my heart. It wasn't just the cry of an animal in distress. It was the sound of something young and helpless and terrified. The second night was worse. The storm just wouldn't quit. I'd been through the routine, checked the fire, checked the windows for ice buildup, made sure nothing was leaking. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that stopped me cold. The crying was clearer now, definitely coming from right outside the cabin. During a brief lull in the wind, I could hear it plainly. 3 distinct voices, all young, all in distress. The sounds they were making weren't quite like anything I'd heard before, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. Whatever was out there was cold, scared, and probably dying. I grabbed my lantern and heavy coat. Common sense told me to stay inside, but something about that sound pulled at me. It was the kind of crying that meant something was hurt and scared and needed help. I'd raised 4 children and helped with countless grandchildren over the years, and that instinct to respond to a baby's cry was too strong to ignore. The cold hit me like a wall when I opened the door. The wind tried to tear the lantern right out of my hands, and the snow was so thick I could barely breathe. But the crying was clearer now, coming from the side of the cabin where the stone foundation meets the frozen ground. I followed the sound, stepping carefully because the snow was already up past my knees in most places and over my waist where it had drifted. The wind kept trying to knock me down, and several times I had to grab onto the side of the cabin to keep from falling. When I got around to the side of the cabin, my lantern light caught something dark huddled against the stone foundation. At first, I thought it was a pile of old blankets or maybe some debris that had blown in during the storm. Then it moved and I realized I was looking at something alive. There were 3 of them pressed together against the cold stone. They were small, maybe the size of 2-year-old children, but their proportions were all wrong. Their arms and legs were too long, their torsos too broad. They were covered in dark reddish-brown fur that was matted and stiff with ice crystals. But it was their faces that stopped me cold. They weren't quite human, and they weren't quite animal, something in between. The bone structure was more human than ape, but the proportions were different. Larger eye sockets, a more pronounced brow ridge, a flatter nose. Their eyes were enormous and dark, and when they looked up at me, I saw intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, something much deeper and more aware. They were dying. I could see that right away. Their breathing was shallow and labored, their bodies shaking so violently they could barely stay upright. Ice had formed on their fur, their eyelashes, even around their nostrils. Whatever they were just babies, and they were freezing to death against my cabin. I didn't think about what they might be or whether they could be dangerous. All I saw were 3 small creatures that desperately needed help. The maternal instinct that had driven me outside was stronger than any fear or confusion about what I was looking at. I pulled off my heavy coat and wrapped it around all 3 of them as best I could. They didn't resist or try to run away. If anything, they seemed to understand that I was trying to help. They made soft, whimpering sounds and pressed closer to my warmth. Their small hands, and they were definitely hands with opposable thumbs and individual fingers, clutching at my clothes. They were heavier than I expected, dense and solid, like children who'd been well fed, but I managed to lift all 3. One was noticeably smaller than the others, probably the youngest, and it seemed the weakest. The 2 larger ones kept making soft sounds to their smallest sibling, as if trying to reassure it. Getting them inside was a struggle. The wind kept trying to push me over, and I couldn't see much with my arms full and my lantern left behind in the snow. Snow was blowing directly into my face. And more than once, I had to stop and feel my way along the wall of the cabin to make sure I was going in the right direction. When I finally got the door open and stumbled into the relative warmth of the cabin, the difference was overwhelming. The creatures in my arms seemed to feel it immediately. Their shivering intensified at first, as if their bodies were shocked by the change in temperature, then gradually began to ease. I set them down in front of the fireplace and wrapped them in every blanket and quilt I could find. Their fur was so cold it felt like touching ice, and they were shivering so violently I was afraid they might be having some kind of seizure. I could see ice crystals everywhere on their fur, their eyelashes, around their nostrils and mouths. I built up the fire as much as I dared and moved them as close to it as possible without risking burns. They seemed to understand what fire was and didn't try to touch it, but they pressed as close as they could get and held their hands out toward the warmth. Their hands were fascinating and disturbing at the same time. They were definitely not human, but they weren't animal paws either. The fingers were longer than human fingers, with an extra joint that allowed them to bend in ways mine couldn't. The thumbs were positioned differently too, giving them a grip that looked incredibly strong and flexible. I warmed some goat's milk on the wood stove, testing it carefully to make sure it wasn't too hot. When I offered it to them, they looked at the cup with obvious intelligence, understanding what I was offering, but uncertain whether to trust me. The largest of the 3 creatures reached out tentatively and touched the cup. then pulled its hand back as if testing the temperature. Finding it acceptable, it took the cup in both hands and drank slowly, watching me over the rim with those enormous dark eyes. The middle one was next, more trusting after seeing its sibling drink safely. It took the cup eagerly and drank deeply, making soft sounds of contentment. The smallest one was the most hesitant. It looked back and forth between me and its siblings, clearly wanting the warmth and nourishment, but afraid to take it. The largest one made soft sounds to it, a kind of gentle cooing that seemed to be encouragement. Finally, the smallest one accepted its own cup and drank. I gave them small pieces of bread and some leftover vegetable stew that I warmed on the stove. They ate carefully, examining each piece of food before putting it in their mouths. Their table manners were surprisingly good. They didn't grab or snatch, and they seemed to understand the concept of sharing. The largest one would often offer food to the smallest one first, making sure it was fed before eating itself. What struck me most was how they communicated with each other. They made soft sounds, not quite language, but definitely meaningful. The largest one seemed to be taking care of the other two, offering them food first, making sure they stayed close to the fire, touching them gently when they seemed frightened. The middle one was curious and adventurous, always looking around at new things. The smallest one was timid but affectionate, staying close to its siblings for comfort. They never took their eyes off me while they ate, not in an aggressive or threatening way, but with intense curiosity. They were studying me just as carefully as I was studying them, trying to figure out what I was and whether I meant them harm. When they had eaten enough to take the edge off their hunger, they huddled together near the fire and seemed to relax for the first time since I'd brought them inside. Their shivering had stopped, and their breathing was deeper and more regular. The smallest one actually fell asleep first, curled against its largest sibling's side. The middle one followed soon after, pressed against the other side. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I kept the fire going and watched them breathe, making sure they were getting warmer and stronger. Part of me was terrified. I mean, what were these things? Where had they come from? But mostly, I just felt protective. They were so small and vulnerable, and they'd been so close to death when I found them. Around dawn, their condition had improved dramatically. They were no longer shivering, and their fur had dried out and fluffed up, making them look larger and healthier. They seemed stronger too, more alert and curious about their surroundings. The largest one got up first and began exploring the cabin, moving carefully and touching things gently. It seemed particularly interested in my collection of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, sniffing them carefully and making soft sounds of curiosity. The middle one joined the exploration, examining everything from the rocking chair to the iron pots hanging by the stove. The smallest one stayed close to the fire, but watched everything its siblings did with interest. When the largest one found a small silver hand mirror on my nightstand, all three of them were fascinated by their reflections. They touched the glass gently, then looked behind the mirror to see where the images were coming from. The middle one made excited sounds and pointed at its own reflection, then at itself, seeming to understand the connection. Their intelligence was undeniable. They weren't just smart animals. They were thinking, reasoning beings with curiosity and problem-solving abilities. When they encountered something they didn't understand, they didn't just react instinctively. They studied it, experimented with it, tried to figure out how it worked. Around mid-morning, they started making different sounds, softer, more musical tones that seemed to be directed at me. It took me a while to realize they were trying to communicate gratitude. The largest one kept pointing to itself, then to its siblings, then to me, making gentle sounds each time. I started talking to them, keeping my voice soft and calm. They seemed to like the sound of human speech, even though they couldn't understand the words. They'd tilt their heads and listen intently, sometimes making soft responses that sounded almost like they were trying to join the conversation. The blizzard kept going for 3 more days. The wind never stopped completely, and the snow continued falling at a rate I'd never seen before. By Wednesday morning, I couldn't even see the goat barn anymore. It was completely buried under a drift that had to be 10 feet deep. The creatures, I'd started thinking of them as my little ones somehow, settled into a routine with surprising ease. They helped me tend the fire, bringing me small pieces of wood from the pile by the door. They seemed to understand that the fire was essential for warmth and life, and they were careful never to let it burn too low. They watched everything I did with intense concentration, as if they were trying to learn how human things worked. When I cooked, they stood nearby and observed every step of the process. When I read aloud from my old books, they sat quietly and listened to the sound of my voice, sometimes making soft sounds that seemed like questions or comments. The smallest one was shyer than its siblings, but it was also the most affectionate. It would sit close to me while I worked on small tasks, sometimes reaching out to touch my hand or arm gently. The largest one was more independent and protective, always keeping an eye on its younger siblings. The middle one was the most curious, always exploring something new or trying to figure out how things worked. They learned incredibly quickly. By the second day, they understood basic cause and effect relationships around the cabin. They knew that wood made fire burn brighter, that fire made warmth, that warmth was good. They knew that certain sounds I made meant I was pleased with them, and others meant I wanted them to be careful. Most amazingly, they seemed to understand the concept of helping without being asked or trained. They started anticipating what I needed and trying to provide it. If I was struggling to reach something, one of them would get it for me. If I was working on a task that required multiple hands, they'd step in to assist. Their concern for each other was touching to watch. The largest one constantly checked on its younger siblings, making sure they were warm enough, fed enough, safe enough. The middle one would share any interesting discovery with the others. The smallest one looked to its siblings for guidance and reassurance, but also showed remarkable bravery for something so young. By Thursday evening, it felt natural having them there. They'd found their places in the cabin's daily routine, and their presence was comforting rather than frightening. When I sat by the fire to read in the evening, they'd settle down nearby. The smallest one often falling asleep against my leg, while the middle one played quietly with interesting objects, and the largest one listened to my voice and watched over everyone. Friday morning, I woke up to an unusual silence. The storm hadn't stopped completely, but the wind had died down enough that I could hear individual sounds again. The settling of snow, the creaking of tree branches, the distant call of a bird that had somehow survived the blizzard. The creatures seemed to sense the change immediately. They went to the windows and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, then back at me, then at the door. For the first time since I'd brought them inside, they seemed restless, even agitated. I bundled up and went outside to assess the damage and check on the goats. The world had been completely transformed. Snow was piled higher than my head in some places, and the familiar landmarks of my property were buried or unrecognizable. Several large trees had come down, and my usual paths were impassable. The creatures followed me to the door, but wouldn't step outside. They stood in the doorway, sniffing the air and making soft sounds to each other that seemed different from their usual communication. There was an urgency to their behavior that made me nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The goats had survived, though they were cold and stressed. Their water had frozen solid, and they had eaten most of their emergency food supply. I spent an hour digging them out and making sure they had fresh food and water, all while the three creatures watched from the doorway with obvious concern. That's when I saw the tracks. They were enormous, at least 20 inches long and 9 inches wide at their widest point. They looked almost human, but with much longer toes and what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The stride length was incredible too, suggesting something much taller and more powerful than any human. The tracks came from deep in the forest, wound around my cabin several times, then headed back into the woods in a different direction. They were fresh, made sometime after the snow had stopped falling, but before I'd come outside, something large had been checking out my property while I slept. I followed the tracks with my eyes as far as I could see into the forest. They moved in a purposeful pattern, not wandering or meandering like an animal's tracks might. Whoever or whatever had made them knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. The tracks went right up to my walls, under my windows, around to the exact spot where I'd found the three small creatures. Then they circled the cabin 3 times before heading back into the deep woods in a straight line. My heart started beating faster as the implications sank in. These tracks belonged to the family of the creatures I'd rescued. Parents, siblings, maybe an entire group had come looking for the missing babies. They'd found the cabin where their children were being sheltered, confirmed they were safe, and then retreated to wait. I looked back at the 3 small faces watching me from the doorway. They were making new sounds now, not quite whimpering, but not quite calling either. Their whole bodies were tense with anticipation, and they kept looking toward the woods where the tracks disappeared. The largest one came outside for the first time, stepping carefully in the deep snow, but moving with obvious purpose toward the edge of the forest. It stopped about 25 feet from the cabin and made a series of calls, louder than any sounds I'd heard from any of them before, carrying clearly through the still air. From somewhere deep in the woods came an answering call, low and resonant, unmistakably similar to what the young one had made, but much deeper and more powerful. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if there were several large creatures spread out through the forest. The other 2 creatures joined their sibling outside, and all 3 of them began making excited sounds toward the woods. They were talking to their family, I realized, letting them know they were alive and well, probably explaining what had happened to them. The sounds from the forest grew closer and more numerous. What had started as distant calls became a complex conversation involving multiple voices of different pitches and tones. Some were definitely adult voices, deep and powerful. Others sounded younger, possibly adolescents or other children. I could hear movement in the woods now, the sound of large bodies pushing through snow and undergrowth. Branches were breaking and snow was falling from disturbed pine boughs. Whatever was out there, there were a lot of them, and they were big. The three young creatures became more and more excited as their family approached. They were practically dancing in the snow, making joyful sounds, and gesturing toward the cabin, toward me, toward the woods. They seemed to be explaining their adventure, describing how they'd been rescued and cared for. Then I saw the first adult. It stepped out from behind a massive cedar tree about 60 yards away. Even at that distance, its size was overwhelming. It had to be 9 feet tall at least, with shoulders broader than any human I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in the same dark reddish-brown fur as the young ones, but there was nothing childlike about its build or bearing. It looked directly at me and went perfectly still, studying me with obvious intelligence. I felt like I was being evaluated, assessed for threat level and intent. The three young creatures ran toward it, calling out in excited voices, but the adult held up one enormous hand, and they stopped immediately. More adults appeared between the trees. I lost count after 15, but there were definitely more than that. They moved silently despite their size, positioning themselves in a loose circle around my property. It was clearly a coordinated effort, the kind of tactical thinking that required communication and planning. The largest one, obviously the leader of the group, stepped forward. It was even bigger than the others, maybe 10 feet tall, with scars across its chest and arms that spoke of a long and dangerous life. Its eyes were the same dark color as the young ones, but there was nothing gentle about its expression. The leader approached slowly and deliberately, each step clearly calculated. It never took its eyes off me, and I could see it was ready to react instantly if I made any threatening moves. The other adults maintained their positions in the circle, effectively surrounding me, though they kept their distance. When the leader was about 15 feet away, it stopped and made a sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from its chest rather than its throat. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was definitely a sound of authority and power. The three young creatures responded immediately, moving to a position halfway between me and their leader. They began making rapid, excited sounds, gesturing toward me, toward the cabin, toward themselves. They were telling their story, I realized, explaining how they'd been caught in the storm, how I'd found them and brought them inside, how I'd fed them and kept them warm. The leader listened without interrupting, its gaze never leaving my face. I could see it processing the information, trying to understand the relationship between its children and this strange human who had sheltered them. Other adults moved closer during this explanation, close enough that I could see the intelligence in their eyes. The family resemblances between them and the young ones. Some were clearly females with slightly smaller builds and more graceful movements. Others were obviously males, larger and more heavily muscled. What struck me most was how human-like their behavior was, despite their non-human appearance. They stood upright naturally, used their hands expressively while communicating, and showed clear emotional responses to what the young ones were telling them. This wasn't just a group of animals. It was a family with all the complex relationships and dynamics that implied. The leader continued to study me while the young ones finished their story. When they were done, it looked back and forth between them and me several times, processing the information and coming to some kind of decision. Then something remarkable happened. One of the young creatures, the largest one that had been bravest throughout their stay, ran back to me and took my hand. It led me forward a few steps, then gestured toward its family leader while making soft musical sounds. I understood what it was doing. It was introducing me, vouching for me, making it clear that I was a friend rather than a threat. The middle one joined us, taking my other hand and adding its own voice to the introduction. The smallest one came too, pressing against my leg and looking up at the leader with obvious hope. The leader's expression began to change. The wariness didn't disappear completely, but it was joined by something that might have been gratitude or respect. It looked at its children, all three obviously healthy and unharmed, despite their ordeal, then back at me. Slowly, deliberately, the massive creature lowered its head toward me. It wasn't quite a bow, but it was definitely a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, understanding that I had helped its children when they needed it most. One by one, every other adult in the group did the same thing. More than a dozen enormous heads lowering in my direction, a moment of recognition that transcended species boundaries. It was the most profound nonverbal communication I'd ever experienced. After the moment of acknowledgement, the leader gently but firmly called its children to come forward. They looked back at me with obvious reluctance, making sounds that seemed like attempts to explain or apologize for having to leave. I knelt down in the snow and let them approach me one last time. The smallest one pressed against me tightly, making a soft sound that could only be described as love. The middle one touched my face gently with one hand, examining me one final time with those curious eyes. The largest one made a complex series of sounds that felt like a thank you in any language. I tried to speak to them to let them know that caring for them had been my privilege, not my burden. I don't think they understood my words, but they seemed to understand my tone and intent. All three of them touched my hands one final time before stepping back toward their family. The leader made a low sound, and immediately the entire group began moving toward the forest. The young ones stayed close to their parents, but they kept looking back at me until the trees blocked them from view. Within minutes, they had vanished completely. The forest swallowed them up as if they had never been there at all. If not for the tracks in the snow and the memories burned into my mind, I might have convinced myself the whole thing had been a dream. The silence after they left was deafening. For 5 days, my cabin had been full of soft sounds, gentle movement, the presence of beings who were learning and growing and communicating. Now it was just me again, and the quiet felt heavy. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of normal activities, but unable to stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The cabin felt huge and empty without my small visitors. I kept expecting to hear their soft calls or see them bringing me pieces of wood for the fire. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every moment of the encounter, from finding them nearly frozen to death to watching them disappear into the forest with their family. Had it really happened? The rational part of my mind insisted it must have been some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation and storm stress. But the evidence was undeniable. The blankets they'd used still smelled different, carrying a wild, outdoorsy scent that wasn't quite like any animal I knew. The cups they'd drunk from were exactly where I'd left them after washing up. And most convincingly, their tracks were still visible in the snow around the cabin, alongside the enormous prints of their family members. I realized that I'd been changed by the experience in ways I was only beginning to understand. For 5 days, I'd been responsible for 3 beings who were entirely dependent on me for survival. I'd felt protective, maternal, connected to something larger than myself in a way I hadn't experienced since my own children were young. Over the next few days, I found myself looking for signs of my former guests. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the distant trees, but I was never sure if it was them or just shadows and wishful thinking. Small things around the property began to change in ways that made me wonder. My woodpile, which had been getting low, appeared larger and more neatly stacked when I went out to get fuel for the fire. Fallen branches that had been blocking paths were moved aside, though I hadn't touched them. Most significantly, I started finding small offerings at the edge of my property. Smooth stones arranged in patterns, bundles of dried berries, interesting pieces of bark with beautiful natural designs. They appeared overnight and were always placed where I'd be sure to notice them during my daily routines. I began leaving offerings of my own, pieces of bread, dried fruit from my pantry, sometimes small, colorful objects that I thought might interest them. They were always gone by morning, though that could have been any number of forest animals. The sense of being watched wasn't frightening. It felt protective. I had the distinct impression that my property was being guarded, that something was looking out for me the way I had looked out for the 3 young ones during the storm. As winter progressed into spring, my understanding of what had happened continued to grow. I'd encountered a family of beings that most people would consider impossible, but they were as real as the mountains and rivers around me. They had intelligence, emotions, family bonds, and social structures that paralleled human society in many ways. More than that, they had demonstrated something that transcended species boundaries, the ability to recognize kindness and respond with gratitude. The brief time I'd spent caring for their young ones had created a bond that continued long after they had returned to their forest home. Spring brought new evidence of their continued presence. Wildflowers appeared in my herb garden in patterns too deliberate to be natural. My vegetable seedlings were protected from late frosts by carefully placed cedar boughs that I hadn't put there. The goat barn, which had suffered some storm damage, was mysteriously repaired one night with materials and techniques I didn't recognize. I began to understand that I was no longer just a solitary human living in the mountain. I was part of a larger community, one that included neighbors I would never see in daylight, but who were watching over me nonetheless. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead it was deeply comforting. Summer brought more subtle signs of my unseen neighbors. Paths through the forest that I used regularly were kept clear of fallen branches and debris. Dangerous areas where erosion had made footing treacherous were marked with carefully placed stones or sticks. It was as if someone was maintaining the mountains specifically for my safety and convenience. The offerings continued too, evolving with the seasons. Summer brought arrangements of berries and edible plants, always varieties I recognized as safe and nutritious. Fall brought nuts and seeds carefully sorted and cleaned. The presentation was always thoughtful, arranged in ways that showed care and consideration. I started spending more time outdoors, partly hoping for another glimpse of my mysterious neighbors, but mostly because the forest felt safer and more welcoming than it ever had before. I would sit on my porch in the evenings and sometimes hear distant sounds. Not quite voices, but not random forest noise either. Conversations perhaps, or maybe songs. The goats had become braver too, venturing farther from their barn than they ever had before. It was as if they sensed the protective presence in the forest and knew they were safe from predators. Indeed, I never lost a single animal to mountain lions or coyotes that summer, despite them ranging freely through areas where losses had been common before. When November came round again, I found myself thinking constantly about the anniversary of my encounter. A full year had passed since that incredible blizzard, since I'd found 3 small creatures dying in the snow and changed both their lives and mine forever. The winter was milder that year with regular snowfalls, but nothing approaching the ferocity of the previous year's storm. I was almost disappointed. Part of me had been hoping for another opportunity to help, another chance to demonstrate that humans could be trusted. On the exact anniversary of the night I'd found them, I heard familiar sounds outside my cabin. Not crying this time, but soft calls that I recognized immediately. I looked out the window and saw tracks in the fresh snow. Not the enormous adult prints I'd seen before, but medium-sized ones. Young adult size perhaps, or late adolescent. I put on my coat and went outside, following the tracks to the edge of my property. There, barely visible in the moonlight, were 3 figures standing at the tree line. They were much larger than they'd been as babies, but still smaller than the adults I'd seen that day in the snow. The same 3 children, now nearly grown. They didn't approach the cabin, but they stood there for several minutes, occasionally making soft sounds in my direction. I had the distinct impression they were saying hello, checking on me, letting me know they were well and hadn't forgotten what I'd done for them. I called out softly, thanking them for coming, telling them how good it was to see them again. They seemed to understand my tone, even if they couldn't comprehend my words. The largest one, I thought it was the same brave one who had first accepted my help a year ago, raised what might have been a hand in something that looked very much like a wave. The middle one bounced excitedly, making happy sounds. The smallest one, still the shyest, pressed close to its siblings but looked toward me with what could only be affection. Then they melted back into the forest, leaving only their tracks and my overwhelming sense of gratitude for this brief reunion. That visit established a pattern that continued for years. Every winter, usually around the anniversary of our first meeting, I would receive some sign that they remembered. Sometimes it was tracks in the snow, sometimes distant calls. Once a small pile of pine cones arranged on my porch in a pattern that spelled out what could have been a crude attempt at letters or symbols. The protective presence never left either. I lived through several more harsh winters and difficult summers, but I never felt truly alone or endangered. Food was always supplemented by wild offerings when my own supplies ran low. Potential hazards around my property were marked or eliminated before I encountered them. My water supply, which should have frozen solid during particularly cold spells, somehow never did. I began to realize that what I'd experienced wasn't just a chance encounter. It was an adoption of sorts. By saving their children, I'd become part of their extended family. The rules and obligations that govern their relationships with each other now applied to me as well. This understanding brought both comfort and responsibility. I was careful never to abuse the protection I was receiving, never to take unnecessary risks or behave in ways that might endanger my unseen guardians. I also made sure to continue offering what I could: food, simple tools, colorful objects that might be useful or interesting to them. The years have passed now, more than I expected when I first came to these mountains. Soon, I'll have to pack up my few possessions and leave this mountain for the last time. I'll move to a small care facility in the valley where I can receive the medical attention and daily assistance that my aging body requires. It will be comfortable and safe, but it won't be home. The life I've lived here, the relationship we've shared, has been the greatest privilege of my existence. To be trusted by beings who have every reason to fear and avoid humans. To be accepted as family by a species not my own. I can't imagine a greater honor. That's all I have to say about it. Make of it what you will. But if you're ever alone in the wilderness and you hear something calling for help, I hope you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified. For more interesting stories, check this out.